Hi everyone. Today I thought it would be fun to look at the Overture to a Midsummer Night's Dream by Felix Mendelssohn. This is going to be a broad introduction to the piece, and so we're not going to go too far into the nitty-gritty of the harmony, but if you haven't taken any music theory, you might still want to watch my videos on harmony and on Beethoven's 7th Symphony first. The harmony video gives you some definitions of terms that may be useful here, and the Beethoven video talks at some length about sonata form, which is also the basic form that Mendelssohn uses in this overture. Before we dive into the piece, let's start by looking briefly at Mendelssohn's early life. Felix Mendelssohn was born in 1809 into one of the most prominent intellectual families in Europe. His grandfather was one of the most famous Jewish philosophers of his day. His name was Moses Mendelssohn. And young Felix and his sister Fanny were both prodigiously gifted in music. Fanny was also showed signs of being an amazing composer in addition to pianist, but unfortunately in the 19th century opportunities for women to compose were really limited, and so it's one of the really sad stories of 19th century music that we don't have more by her. So we start the story of a lot of composers' lives by saying how prodigious they were, how they were so advanced at a young age, that they'd written so much by the time they were 12, and so on. And all of this is true for Mendelssohn, but what sets him apart is that he seems to have reached musical maturity sooner than just about anyone else. The great poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe lived long enough to hear both the young Mozart and the young Mendelssohn play, and he famously said that Mendelssohn's playing bore, quote, the same relation to the little Mozart that the perfect speech of a grown man does to the prattle of a child. In other words, Mendelssohn was way more advanced at a young age than even Mozart. Of course, both Mozart and Mendelssohn would write some of the greatest masterpieces in the history of classical music, but the difference is that two of Mendelssohn's greatest triumphs were written when he was a teenager. His string Octet, which I heartily recommend checking out, was written when he was 16, and the piece that we're looking at today, the Overture to Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream, was finished when he was 17. As if that weren't enough, Mendelssohn was also a very talented artist. Here are a couple of examples of his work. Much later in life, Mendelssohn would follow up on this overture by writing incidental music to the whole play. It's in this music that we find the famous Wedding March, the Scherzo, and the Nocturne. As well as lots of wonderful little pieces that accompany some of the dialogue and action of the play, and some of which riff on the themes that Mendelssohn had written for the overture back when he was a teenager. In case you haven't read it, or it's been a while, for now you just need to know that Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream contains characters from many realms of existence. There's King Theseus, who's about to be married to the Amazon queen Hippolyta. There are four young people, Hermia, Lysander, Demetrius, and Helena, in love with one another in a mixed-up sort of way at various points in the play. There are fairies, including Oberon, the king of the fairies, Titania, queen of the fairies, and Puck, Oberon's mischievous servant. And there's a group of artisans called the Mechanicals who are rehearsing a play, and one of them, Nick Bottom, will eventually put on a donkey's head and, through a magic potion, become the love object of Titania. So all of this takes place in the woods. That is, it's away from everyday reality. And indeed, by the end of the play, we'll question whether any of this was actually real. It's one of the most enchanting romantic comedies ever written, and I hope you'll read it or watch a video of it. The language is amazing, and the way that Shakespeare interweaves these worlds of characters is, I think, just magical. One of the magnificent things about Mendelssohn's overture is that he depicts all of these groups of characters in the music, while still creating a piece of music that doesn't require any knowledge of the play to be appreciated. So in other words, it makes perfect sense as a work, as like a symphonic piece in terms of its forms and its themes, but when you do know something about the play, your understanding becomes much richer, and you can revel in Mendelssohn's sort of fertility of invention and his ability to unite all of these disparate components and characters and themes into one unified and united whole. We're going to use a very recent recording with Sir John Eliot Gardiner conducting the London Symphony Orchestra. to help us on our way through this talk. And it's a particularly colorful reading, and I've chosen it because Gardiner really tries to evoke some of the playing styles of the 19th century while working with one of the great modern orchestras playing modern instruments. So I'll post links to some other recommended recordings in the comments section below this video, so you can also check out some other terrific interpretations. The overture starts with 4 magical woodwind chords. I often think Rimsky-Korsakov was probably inspired by this moment when he wrote those woodwind chords that we've looked at the beginning of Scheherazade. Mendelssohn starts with just 2 flutes playing a major third, E and G sharp. You can think of these 2 flutes like panpipes, sort of evoking the setting in the woods. Then 2 clarinets are added and they expand the range just a little bit downward. So we went from 2 notes to 4 notes. Now we're going to expand much farther when 2 bassoons and a horn are added. Here are those notes rolled one after the other. Bassoon, bassoon, horn, clarinet, clarinet, flute, flute. And then, finally, all the woodwinds and both horns play the final E major chord. It begins softer than any of the others, swells, and then diminishes. The third chord, though, was a surprise. We would expect an A major chord. So first we have like E major, at least it seems that way, and then B major. So the 1 chord and the 5 chord. And now we'd think A major would be nice. That's the normal chord in the key. But instead of an A major chord, it's an A minor chord. This one. Mendelssohn puts C natural instead of C sharp. I think that chord is a hint that everything won't be sunny throughout this piece, and that right after these wind chords, we're going to abruptly shift into E minor. After those 4 chords set the stage, the strings enter, and they would be playing the same chord that the winds just played, except that the second violins, instead of playing G sharp, they play G natural. So we get an E minor chord instead of E major. And now the strings begin to scurry in music that depicts the fairies. Mendelssohn became particularly well known as a pioneer of this kind of light as a feather, gossamer music filled with tiny little details. It was still quite an unusual move in orchestral music to divide the 2 violin sections here, but Mendelssohn does this, so we have 4 independent voices of violins, all playing very soft, very staccato, and pretty high in register. And for the second phrases, these scurrying violins are joined by the violas playing pizzicato, also pretty high, which kind of punctuates the violins playing with their bows and creates a bass line. Just as the strings seem to be leading to a cadence and a rival point, the woodwinds return, but this time with a very mysterious chord, a diminished 7th chord. This happens twice, as if the strings can't quite finish their sentence without the woodwinds ending it with this question mark. Finally, though, the third time's the charm, and the full orchestra comes in. This is a shock, E major. It reverses the original twist when we went from major to minor. And it brings us fully into the sunlight of E major. This music represents the royal couple, Theseus and Hippolyta, and it's filled with these brass fanfares and resolute harmony. And incidentally, if there were any doubt about which themes depict which characters, Mendelssohn made it really clear 17 years later when he wrote his incidental music, and he accompanies entrances and dialogue of each one of these character groups with their corresponding theme from the overture. So this is definitely the royals. Now, if you remember from our discussion of sonata form in the Beethoven 7 video, we'd expect a first theme to be in the tonic, that is in the home key, and then a second theme, usually in the dominant, or in another more distant key. And I mentioned there that the first theme doesn't have to be a single melody or idea, but it could be a whole group of themes as long as they're in the same key. And that's basically what happens here. We've got the E minor fairy idea, and we've got the E major royal idea, and they're both in the first theme group. The really clever thing, though, that Mendelssohn is doing is that they're also intimately related, right? The fairy idea, da 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 da, and the royal idea, da 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 da. It has that same descending idea from the tonic, from the first scale degree. So they're really closely related, the royals and the fairies, in this thematic linking. Mendelssohn then makes this link really clear by returning to the fairy idea, but now in the full orchestration and the grand style of the royal theme. Now at this moment, with this very surprising chord, we reach the very brief transition to the second theme with these tense flute harmonies and echoes of the fairy idea in the strings. After 8 bars, this gives way to the second theme, now firmly in the key of B major, the dominant, and sung really lovingly on the clarinet, followed by the violins. I think this has to be the lover's theme, filled with longing leaps and chromaticism in the violin melody. The winds, brass, and timpani try to put a stop to this sentimental nonsense with some brusque chords, but the strings won't give up. The winds, brass, and timpani try again to stop it, but now the strings take off on a flight of chromatic fancy that leads us into another, but very different theme in B major. These are the rude mechanicals, those artisan actors who are working on a play for the royal wedding. And Mendelssohn goes so far as to depict the braying of the donkey and those magnificent leaps of a major ninth. Remember that Bottom's going to be wearing a donkey's head for much of the play. This rustic jollity is cut off by some more brass fanfares, almost like they're saying, no more rehearsals, it's time for the wedding. And the big royal tune comes back, but significantly in B major, the dominant key. which makes it a final closing theme to the exposition section. At the second that the exposition ended with that chord, the strings start the fairy thing again above, but this time in B minor. The development has begun, and as is typical of developments, we're going to feel quite unstable and sometimes lost in terms of where we are in harmonic direction. This development is mostly preoccupied with the fairy idea, punctuated by the royal fanfare and those eerie woodwind chords like we had in the beginning. All the time, single notes and little fragments of other themes keep popping in and out of the texture. That sort of thing. As if you're running through a dark forest and you keep bumping into trees that you worry might actually be goblins. You can't actually see what they are. I'll let you discover the rest of that on your own, but it's really spooky, right? Now, at the very end of the development, a little melody that we heard at the end of the Lover's tune comes back. It used to sound like this. But now it's transformed into minor, and it seems to have lost the energy to continue. So right here we end the development seemingly pretty conclusively in C sharp minor. That's the relative minor of our home key, E major. That is, those two keys, C sharp minor and E major, share the same key signature. And it seems like this is the end of the story, until on the very last resigned string chord, those two flutes from the beginning of the piece come back and take the two notes they first played, E and G sharp, and float them on top of the C sharp minor chord in the strings. Those two notes are held in common between those two harmonies, and the flutes gently then lead us back to the beginning and those memorable woodwind chords. The recapitulation starts almost exactly the same way as the exposition, except that those surprising wind and brass notes that punctuated so much of the development are back here, still linked with the fairy theme. There's more urgency now with some timpani tattoos and low grumblings on this low brass instrument. Originally, Mendelssohn wrote it for a clumsy-sounding English bass horn, which is now completely obsolete. He then changed it to an ophicleide by the time of publication, and most modern orchestras use the tuba. But the tuba is really too elegant for this purpose. The ophicleide and the English bass horn had this kind of grumbling quality that I think is important for this overture and that Mendelssohn was going for. Check out the video description below for some links about the ophicleide. It's a really awesome instrument that really ought to be played more, I think, now when we're playing this old music. Instead of the fairy music linking into the royal theme this time, this oboe idea you're about to hear takes us directly to the second theme group, the lover's theme, but this time staying in our home key of E major. The other themes follow in their original order now, rounding everything off with the royal theme, which, though it was skipped a moment ago at the beginning of the exposition, now comes back in its full glory and in its home key, and it seems that we really should be finished now. But just like at the start of the development, we're back with the fairies. This time, though, after a minute, one of those questioning woodwind chords stops everything with a fermata, and there's this long descending flute melody, which leads us to a more peaceful tempo. And we're left with just clarinets and bassoons here, this simple cadence, and just as the woodwinds finish their cadence and we get back home, there's a distant pizzicato and the bass and cello, and now the violins come in. They're singing the royal theme, but in a completely new guise, pianissimo and legato, first in its original rhythm, and now in quarter note triplets, 2 and 2, before they dissolve into a series of plagal cadences, that is going from the subdominant, the 4 chord, to the 1 chord, the 4 chord, back to the 1 chord. It happens over and over as things get more and more peaceful. Mendelssohn brought back this wistful version of the royal wedding theme in his incidental music when Oberon, the fairy king, speaks his final speech to the fairies, telling them to bless the humans now that the lovers have all been united and every tension is resolved. And so he speaks over the music. With this field do consecrate, each fairy take his gate, and each several chamber bless through this palace with sweet peace. And the owner of it blessed ever shall in safety rest, trip away, make no stay, meet me all by break of day. The overture ends with the same chords that began it, as if none of that had happened. As Puck says in the last speech of the play, "If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here, while these visions did appear." I hope this has whet your appetite to listen to lots of Mendelssohn, and particularly his music for A Midsummer Night's Dream. I'd also really check out that Octet as well. Those are great places to start. And please let me know if you have any questions or want to talk about any of this, and hope to talk with you all soon.